Welcome everyone for the second session in our Buber seminar. Most of you were here also last time. I see a few new faces. That's great. You'll get a chance to briefly introduce yourselves later on. We're not going to go through the whole round again. That would take too long. But as you will have seen, I have put a folder with literature on Google, and I've given everyone access to that via the email. There's Carrie. Hi, Carrie. I recognize your face.
Hello.
Hi, and Peter. Hi, Peter. Yeah. And Anastasia as well. Cool. Okay.
Hello.
Hi. Right. Okay. So I'll start again. Welcome everyone. Welcome to the second Buber seminar. Where I was just saying we have a few new faces. That's great. They'll get a chance to briefly introduce themselves in a little while. I've made a folder on Google Docs, as you will have seen, and I'm very happy that people are already sort of posting literature there and sending literature around to the group. That is something that I hope we can continue. Like we said last time, Vic and I very much like this to be a joint creation, this seminar. So that sort of stuff is really welcome. Fred sent a wonderful article on Alfred Schutz and Buber just now, which I've also put there. I've started to put your personal statements in a Google Doc, and that's up there, and everybody can add theirs if you want to, or you can send it to me and then I'll add it. I haven't done that for all the statements that I've received over the last few days because I've been quite busy, but I'll do that. I'll do that in a hang on. I'll do that in a little while. I'm just responding here to a message. So you can use the chat for any questions or comments that you have. You can also speak. As with last time, when you speak, you agree that your voice will be part of the recording. I wanted to make these recordings available in the sort of off weeks, so we can listen back to what we've been talking about in preparation for the next one, and that is what's going to happen. But for this particular session, that didn't really work. The AV department was too busy, and they haven't. It's a little bit bureaucratic because we just get the link and I can just send it out to you, but they want to edit it and put a nice little leader in front of it, School of Advanced Study, and so I'm not supposed to send them out, but I'll try to make sure that we get this one well on time. Yeah, that's a little bit on housekeeping. There's a bit more, but we'll get to that in a minute. For today, we have a really big task ahead of ourselves, and that is to start to make sense of this article distance and relation, which I've given to everyone as pre-reading. It is one of the later texts by Buber, written in 1950, and it is considered to be a central text of his later output, and we will sort of discuss why and try to understand what he is talking about in terms of these concepts of distance and relation and the function that they have in his philosophy. And we'll also ask ourselves what they mean for us today. So that is the task. And Vic and I were sort of preparing this, thinking how might we go about this in the best way possible. And so what we came up with was sort of the first reading, second reading structure. Of course, it's up for discussion, and people can make suggestions for changes, of course, all the time. But we thought that it might be a good idea to just do a quick round and for people to just give a brief comment on their experience of reading the text, what it maybe any particular questions that they have or comments. I'll just write them down, and so that we have that as a kind of we have all those questions up in the air. If you haven't read it or haven't had time to read it, that's fine. Then just listen. Then I will give a short introduction, contextualization of the chapter, just very briefly how it fits into the overall ideas of Buber, and also why we think it is an interesting text. And then we will have a discussion about it in which we try to to sort of get to into the depth of it. It's an essay that for many people maybe who are not so familiar with this kind of writing or philosophy from this period may appear a little bit alien or strange. It's not a normal academic paper. It's a philosophical text. It's a reflective text in which thinking is happening in a very particular way. It speaks to a very particular intellectual tradition. So we want to sort of do justice to that slightly alien character of the text as well, which requires perhaps quite a fundamental way of engaging with it in order to really get to all the ideas that are in it and find out what the text is about. So that will be the plan for today. We'll have a little break at 5 o'clock UK time. If that's okay with everyone, then I would like to ask Vic maybe briefly to just say a little bit about where you are at this point in time, physically, mentally, with respect to Buber, so that we can then go into the round. So maybe I'll give you just the first speaking slot about this text in our round. Would that be okay?
Sure. So this is a kind of text of the moment in that we're meeting in relation with each other, but also at a distance through technology. So I think it's important to kind of realize how experimental what we're doing in meeting together in some way across the world in terms of the reach of the seminar. So it's not just that the space is extended from a room in Senate House into a wider space, but it's the way that we are both distant and can come into relationship with each other through this new technology. There's a temptation to think, particularly in universities at the moment, that this is just an alternative form of delivery of knowledge. But in fact, it reshapes our experience and our relationships. And it's different in a way that's going to take us time to really come to terms with. It's distant in terms of that it can be exhausting in a way that it can almost drain your energy in a particular kind of way. But it can also be a space in which we can connect and hear and listen to each other across space in a way which would have been impossible without this technology. So we can hear each other, but we're also listening to each other across very different intellectual and cultural and political contexts in which we're living. And that touches the kind of second point that I just wanted to say something. Keep in mind, which is the context of COVID, in which we are enclosed in and distanced from people we are really close to. And that raises what distance means in relationships. So we can both be locked in or feel that we're locked in, and often locked in with other people in a kind of smaller space, in a limited space, in a restricted space, in a lockdown space. But in another way, we can reach out in relationship in this COVID time through these new technologies. So I think this paper helps us think both those issues and makes alive the context in which we're trying to think together experimentally as a kind of, as a group that's beginning to shape and beginning to form. But it will also take time for us to hear each other, and often we will mishear. So it's a matter of how do we develop between ourselves a way of really engaging and listening in a way that might be unfamiliar within a traditional academic setting. So there's a way that Buber already challenges practices of teaching and learning and calls upon us to listen to each other in different ways and to shape different alternative modes of communication. And this is what Johan and myself are hoping in the context of this experimental seminar. So that's just my putting in, as we just, if we just go round and people say something about what the text in their first reading of it has meant to them, reading it in this moment, in this time, in this space.
I said, thanks, Vic. That's all very relevant, and indeed, we have this unique opportunity to be together as a group of people that normally would not be able to meet in this way, or would not maybe be able to do, but would not do it. So, what does that mean as a chance for the between that you mentioned, Vic, and that for Buber is such a central category? And trying to understand what that is and inhabit this between also means that we think in a different way about coming together to talk about an academic subject such as a philosophy. It's not a teaching space, it's a learning space, but in a different way. And how that's experimental. I'm very much aware of that because I find it very difficult. Talking into the emptiness of the machine, I immediately fall back on my attempt to start to lecture and to explain and everything, and I don't want to do that. So thanks for reminding us of that. I'm going to go around and just, like we said, respond briefly in terms of what the reading of this paper has done to you and the questions or comments that you have. I'll go around the way everybody appears on my screen, which may not be the way it is on your screen. So I'm going to start with Marcus.
Thank you. I'm not sure I'm the best person to start, but certainly I will try. First of all, I find it to be beautifully written. I think it is written differently from some of the earlier work of Buber, but that's just a kind of subjective view. I think the issue of distance and technology is a very important one. And if we can utilize Buber and his approaches to change the kind of technology which is provided to us by social media, the kind of virulent attacks on people, on people, which really happen when people do not understand that they are dealing with other human beings who have different views, different perceptions, and different understandings of the subject on which they are shouting insult over the subject which they are shouting insults to each other. I found the very interesting comment about animals and his explanation of the difference, but I think he may have missed something in terms of animals not being able to recognize tools that can be reused, but animals do collect food which they store and don't necessarily consume immediately. Therefore, perhaps this is another area of the difference between animals and humans that could be looked at. I also found the way in which he ended the document, talking about the air of chaos which comes into being, which I believe we are totally living in today. And if one takes into account COVID and the different views on COVID, I mean, one of the real problems about the way in which the government, at least in this country, is treating citizens regarding comment is there is no dialogue. And no attempt to understand the fears of the people who are being preached to by the various members of the government. However, I don't think really I can say anything more about the article. I just think it is an excellent piece and a very good way to start.
That's great.
Thanks, Marcus. Yeah, he writes himself that if we ever reach the stage of making ourselves understood only by means of the dictograph, that is, without contact with one another, the chance of human growth would be indefinitely lost. So there already kind of a beginning to thinking about technology.
Yeah, absolutely.
Communication technology. And this point about the relation to nature, it's obviously something that will concern us a lot. Okay, I'm going around quickly, so we should have about half an hour for this or so. Irem, you are next up.
I have to say, I had to get back into the rhythm of reading German philosophers who take 30 pages to say something that they could usually say in 7. I think I was particularly struck by his comment, by the section where he's talking about 2 men who are trying to convince each other of their point of view, and nevertheless unreservedly accepts and confirms him in his being as this man and in his being made in this particular way. And of course, that's an ideal, because I think that that's something that we don't do very often, that there's always in those conversations some element of fixing, and that we can fall into that role of seeing others as objects rather than fully individuated, especially when we're trying to convince them of something. And I think capitalism is very akin to that insect society he was talking about, where no one is seen apart from their role in a larger machine. So it really, in terms of today, it got me thinking about narcissism, which we're seeing in a number of our leaders. Let's hold back on any names, shall we? And because you need that distance, you need that I and that thou. Since narcissists see everything as an extension of themselves, are they actually capable of having that kind of dialogue and that kind of relationship? I'm not sure about that. And I was also struck, and I think it was in the afterword, by how much he talked about his sort of coming into the Lubavitcher Hasidic, sort of Hasidic realm, how much that began to inform his writing and what he was doing. So I'll just leave that there, except to say to Fred that was the first time, having lived in the UK for 24 years, I haven't heard "aw nuts" in a very long time. And I love your t-shirt.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Ira. Yeah, so just a highlight from what you said, this point about convincing, I think is very interesting. In the article, he talks about convincing as propaganda manipulation, but also another kind of convincing, which seems to be very much part and parcel of this I-thou relation, in which a unique recognition of the other as other is present. And I think that's something interesting to explore. Okay, so Barbara and Erik, I just got a message saying you haven't read the text, but is there any comment that you would like to make? Maybe just briefly introduce yourselves. Irem, I didn't ask you to introduce yourself, but you're new as well, so I should have asked that, but I'll get back to you.
Hello, I'm Erik, obviously. This is Barbara. I haven't read this text. Another book of Buber I listened to, an audiobook. Yes, well, I live in Nijmegen. Barbara lives in Utrecht, in the Netherlands. And I studied philosophy actually with Johan many years ago. And I work as a trainer, so I train managers and stuff. A lot of this online, obviously, nowadays. That's a short introduction of myself.
Yes. My name is Barbara, and I'm a social psychologist. So it's very interesting to read a little bit more about the philosophy of communication. And this is my first attempt. I've just read the first page. So.
Okay, good. We'll get to that later on. Thanks very much, and welcome to the seminar. Artemis. your response.
Hello, everyone. I think I was definitely struck by the same section that Erin referred to, but I found it. I didn't find it. I found it interesting in the sense of understanding how what space this is that he was trying to communicate in the previous 30 pages. As you said, you know, it could be a bit more condensed, and I think that was my favorite part as well, because exactly I started to understand how after individuating and separating man from the general environment, we can start exploring that space where our totalities meet and try to converse. And also by the very ending of the text, where he says that being accepted into community is to part of communication, that we all need some sort of nod that allows us to be fully ourselves in a group. That was very interesting for me as well. Of course, he doesn't explain it. There was this tiny part about tonality that he makes reference to, and I would like to discuss that because it's so tiny and it's very interesting depending on how tonality is understood. Whether it's the construct or it's a general description. So yeah, that would be a question about this very tiny paragraph that was.
Yeah, thanks, Artemis. I also had that question. There's one remark there about nude sculptures and one about tonal music, and so it's very interested to see how that relates to the between. So we must get back to that. Also, the self-being at the end. Self-being is passed on from one person to another, like he calls it heavenly bread, manna. And I think that has a lot to do with how we've used the nature of the social. So we'll get back to that. Thank you. Patricia.
Yes, I think I have maybe two very small questions, maybe not so small. The one is maybe not so small, but it's about this, this question how these two concepts, distance and relation, relate to the concepts of the I, it, and the I-thou relation that he introduced in his earlier work, right? Yeah. Is this just a modification, or is he trying something new? So I'm a little bit puzzled about the relation between these two works. And then I'm also, maybe a little bit puzzled about the fact that he describes distance and relation as two movements. So, and with regard to distance, I've been thinking whether he thinks of distancing as either something that is constitutive of our human situation, or something that is maybe more an achievement, something that one has to create for oneself. So, yeah.
I think that's right. I think he thinks of distance as almost not prior necessarily temporally, but you have to be able to somehow step back and see something or someone as separate from you in order for you to engage in a relationship with them.
Yeah. Well, I'll get to that. This is a very important question. Just to point out, which I put in my email, in German, the title was Urdistanz und Beziehung. So in this Urdistanz, that's really like originary distance or primordial distance. Mm. So it's almost, that almost leads us, in terms of look at it in terms of history of philosophy, to think of a kind of transcendental reduction or so, a kind of going back to a level before the empirical selves that we are. But that's very much going against the spirit of the text. So it's a good question how to understand that distancing. I do have a response also in terms of the relation between the I, it, I-thou distinction. We will get to that in a minute. Thanks very much. Katrina.
Is that me?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, a quick question first on a philological point. I wonder if I have the right version. I have 1950, and I don't have any references to tonality or nude sculpture in the one I was reading.
Did you read the German, or?
I would have loved to have read the German, but it's a version from a reader that's recently published by Palgrave, so it is a translation, and I wanted to.
Oh, that is very interesting.
Yeah.
So it's the end of section 2 of Distance and Relation.
Oh, okay, maybe I skipped over something. Anyway, that wasn't, I mean, I'm very interested in what he writes about art as expressing the desire to enter into a personal relation with things and to imprint this relation on things. So that, but I think the most moving part I found, given our COVID context, is partly the dictaphone. Yeah, that thing about the dictation machine. That's kind of almost what we're doing, it feels like a lot of the time.
Yeah.
But that we can try and reach beyond that. And where it seems to be strongest in its statement of where we should be trying to aim with our communication is this mutual or reciprocal confirmation of each other in being this person who is made in this particular way. So this dieser Mensch ist so beschaffen. And that this, he says, in a moment of rare kind of almost melancholy, this is a capacity that we have that currently lies fallow. And I wonder, maybe it lies even more fallow at the moment. But one thing, and I would love to read the German next time around, because as a feminist and as a female reader of Buber, I am troubled by the translating, always using man instead of for Mensch. It does make you feel excluded. And I think if you're reading Mensch, it makes you feel less excluded.
Right.
So, and then the other point, it's already been raised about the animals. So the first respondent said this. I was also struck by the anthropocentrism. While I was drawn to so many of the concepts and to so much of the argument, there is a human exceptionalism at work here that makes a lot of assumptions about presence and being of other species, and that does set the achievement of humanity as higher than those of other species. And I wondered if that's a moment where we can start to trouble the text a little.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. I think these are absolutely crucial remarks. Yeah. Vic, do you want to respond or?
Well, I think that's key in terms of whether there is a kind of framing in Buber out of the tradition that he's emerging, which is the human is in some way transcendent or seen as somehow the significant through which we kind of render meaning. And I think that's a deep assumption that links back in some way to the translation both of man and to what extent he's in some way thinking in masculine terms. So it's a particular form of exclusion that's already written into the way that language, also in German, even using Mensch in German, that has that kind of masculine framing, and to what extent Buber is still somehow caught within that, partly because he wants this piece to be a more general statement, almost a kind of the next generation from the Ich und Du, the kind of I and thou, which has a more personal framing.
Yeah, that's right. And this word Mensch is related to man. You know, that is the word mind and mnemonics. All these words are related, and they all go back to the mind, really. And that's so. But that's exactly. And also the relation to nature. I think once we start to say that speech is somehow the defining thing, or that which gives us access to this particular personal relationship in which dieser Mensch ist so und so beschaffen, or this individuality of things, that of course we enter into these problems. So thanks, wonderful. Fred. You need to unmute yourself.
There we go.
Yeah.
Well, hello, everybody. I missed the first session. Sorry for that. And it's really amazing that this particular time and everybody having Zoom conversations makes it possible for somebody like me living in Dallas, Texas, to participate in a seminar that's taking place on the other part of the world. And so in some ways, it's been a great benefit, especially because I don't have young children in school and I don't see patients in the medical center where I work. The COVID-19 has not interfered with my life in the same way it's interfered with many of my colleagues. I guess I should just say that have a very long-standing interest in the nature of science. and what it is that makes science possible. And that began a long time ago with my participating in studies on Alfred Schutz to understand about intersubjectivity, which is the basics of all social relations, and then science depends on those relations. And Buber happened at the same time. So I was particularly interested in the seminar and the topic because recently I've been thinking a lot in the area of bioethics about Niels Bohr and the idea of complementarity. And in complementarity, there's this juxtaposition of the actor and spectator. And actor and spectator somehow sounds like distance and relation, or sounds like I, thou, and I juxtaposed to each other. And of course, Bohr ends up, when he's knighted, adopting the yin-yang symbol as his family crest. So I thought that participating in the seminar would give me an opportunity to think more about that particular topic. So I'm so happy that you're having it.
Thanks very much. We'll get to talk about that, I'm sure, as well. Okay, Rochelle.
Hi. Yeah, apologies that I also missed last week. I actually found out that this seminar was happening the day after the seminar happened.
Okay, that's fine.
Sorry?
Welcome.
Thank you. Should I introduce myself really quickly?
Yeah, very briefly, yeah, great.
Yeah. So I'm writing upstage at Queen Mary. I work on Nietzsche, but specifically comprehension. And so this sort of fit in. But I did unfortunately read the wrong texts. I clicked on the wrong ones. So okay. I'm afraid I don't have anything to contribute, but thank you for having me in any case.
Yeah, that's no problem. I'm sure there's a lot to that you can contribute. Thanks and welcome. Liam.
Hi. So about the text, on a purely sort of philosophical note, what struck me was what I thought was influence of Heidegger and the discussion of tools and the technology and readiness to hand, etc., etc. So I tend to say etc., etc., and I shouldn't say it. And the other thing was, I'm not sure if I'm mistaken in this, but I had echoes of Jean-Luc Nancy, the contemporary French thinker, and his idea of his ontological sort of idea that presence is always co-presence. So the ontology is always collective. And I think that chimes with the idea of relation, obviously. And then on a purely sort of emotional basis, I found the text quite moving, quite beautiful, especially the sort of ending pages, especially the very last 2 or 3 paragraphs about human need for confirmation and acknowledgement, the mutuality of it. It's very sort of immediately touching, I think. Which is another thing. Touching is something that we're not allowed to do in this time. And then the question I have is Buber's notion of grace, which he seems to use in page 64 as a sort of ideal moment of relation, where there's a sort of ideal unity within the tension of distance and relation, which he calls grace. So obviously that's something I'd like to explore if we could.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks very much. I think the point about Heidegger is, of course, very well placed. People who know Silent Side will see the obvious way that he has used key ideas there to make his point. When we discuss it, maybe I'll say a bit about that in terms of, I think he uses Kant as a template in I and Thou, and he uses Heidegger as a template in this text in order to say something that goes beyond both of them. And that's how he does it. That's his relation to philosophy. He treats it like a quarry, and he gets from it what he needs, and then he moves on to saying his own thing. Nancy, of course, gets it all from Levinas, and Levinas gets it all from Buber. Yeah, so
Exactly. Yeah.
there's a kind of history there. And I think thank you very much for also these remarks about touch. I think touch can be seen as the performance of this codependence or the going together of distance and relation, and definitely in a way that's very different from the way that Sartre conceptualizes touch as always involving the objectification of the other. So he's trying to think touch in a very different way, and I think in a very interesting way. So thanks very much. And we'll get to these topics as we go into the text. Andreas.
Hi, everybody. The point is that I'm working on neoliberalism myself. I'm dealing with text from Hayek, Friedman, and all this kind of stuff. And it's a nice way to bring me back into a certain balance. It's entirely out of place with what I'm dealing at the moment. And the thing that Buber, who's reproducing the Hasidic teachings, comes through this discussion, and I would like to come even more to the fore. It's rather interesting in search of alternatives to utter individualization that neoliberalism has created and what we have been experiencing in the last several decades. I might say that's the way I approach it, at least at the moment, more politically, I might say.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay, yeah, but we'll talk about, and yeah, maybe some of you have already read Leuwi's article on Martin Buber's socialism, with his key idea of the post-social, which is a kind of, I think, relates to some of the things that you're working on, Andreas. Okay, Peter.
Thank you. Good to see people again. Actually, Andreas' comment maybe a nice segue to what struck me as well. I mean, first thing to say, maybe just that I found it a challenging essay to read. I thought it was not easy to work through. Also thought it was very nicely written, as somebody said before. Would be interested to see the German, but it's nice, it carries you along. And for me, it was a mixture of sort of interesting insights and then suddenly hitting a sentence where I said to myself, not quite sure what that particular sentence meant. Sometimes you have the time to chew over it, and sometimes you just keep going and hope you'll get back to it later on. But as several people have commented, I myself, particularly coming at it from the perspective of political theory and in the context of a presidential election here in the States, found some of the closing pages quite interesting to read. Somebody was quoting from page 69 earlier about the encounter between two people. There's another part of the same passage, not precisely the same part that was quoted before, that stood out to me. This idea of wanting to influence other people, which he described as the effort to let that which is recognized as right, as just, as true, through one's influence, take seed and grow in the form suited to individuation. And I sort of was interested in thinking about that because it doesn't, that there's still an edge there of truth and rightness, right? It doesn't simply, the idea of confirming the other doesn't merely slide into a kind of relative, anybody thinks anything, whatever, and we don't care about that at all. But it's not a hostile, confrontational insistence on compelling the other to adopt my position. And so I was intrigued by how that might be a way to think about conversation. It's a little different from what we see in many of our heated, polarized political disputes. While also, at the same time, the last page is so section 4. I'm not entirely sure I got everything he was trying to get at in section 4. And there is a question for me as to what extent I think he presents an appealing alternative to some of the ways we relate to each other in the public sphere, and to what extent I think he presents an idealistic vision that isn't really realizable in the public sphere, that might even underestimate some of the ways in which liberalism and capitalism actually allow for a relation, sort of distance and relation at the same time. And so there's just some of the things that are kind of kicking around in my mind as I read.
Okay, thanks. And that's very important, because this relation to, so what can Buber mean for a theory of the public sphere today is one of the things that, as we're talking about these bubbles in which people are more and more locked up, this lockdown is a kind of general metaphor for society. I think these are very important questions. So, and I think this relation between convincing and individuation is very interesting. It's almost as if there's a kind of radically new rhetoric brewing underneath the surface, a new way to think about how we relate to each other in a tensed or intentional way, rather than merely exchanging facts or opinions. Thanks very much. Daniel.
Hi. Couple of things that spoke to me, one which I found distracting and the other which I found very moving. Distracting one, which was interesting, was how much are we part of nature and how much do we transcend nature. But on the whole, I found most of his comments about animals and what they can do and can't do. It took me down roads. I kept questioning, is that true? What would an animal expert say, and so on. And it didn't seem that relevant to much of what he was trying to achieve.
Yeah.
The part that I found very powerful was the essence about there being both distance and relation in our relationship with others. And perhaps I was too quick to assimilate it to what I understand. In other words, I think we're all applying it to the knowledge we already had from elsewhere. So the British School of Psychoanalysis, Psychotherapy, the object relations idea, which perhaps we better describe as subject relations, was a big step, which I think is now very much accepted, that whereas Freud had stressed that we become ourselves by separation, by distance, from mummy or the breast or the parent, and develop our ego, I think the modern British school would be saying that we do it simultaneously with distance and with the relation. In other words, that we both need to separate from mummy or parent, but we also must relate to mummy and parent and develop a relationship. And it's the two together, the double movement, which helps us become who we are. And I found the language in Buber, human life and humanity come into being in genuine meeting, or he said, and it says that the other person both limits me, but also allows me to grow. And I think it's that double awareness that we can be very scared of the other as a threatening, limiting person who impinges on my development, or we can over rely on the other. But that double movement is so important. And similarly, when he says the inmost growth of the self is not accomplished in man's relationship to himself, but in the relationship between the one and the other. So all of that spoke very powerfully to me, both that we simultaneously need to distance in order to survive in a way, and yet need to relate in order to become human in any meaningful way.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I think that's really the heart of the essay, is to say that distance and relation are intrinsically linked. And so he seems to say distance is a preposition of relation, but I would go one step further and say they presuppose each other in equal measure. And it seems to me that this is why there is a fundamentally new idea of communication coming up here, which cannot be thought in any of the traditional notions of philosophical rationality that the tradition has developed from ancient dialectics to contemporary phenomenology or hermeneutics. It doesn't fit in that frame. It's something new. So that'll be very interesting to explore. Also the relation to psychoanalysis. This nature thing, yes, we must. I just wanted to say, because I was thinking of that as other people made the same point. I think just as he is in conversation with many of, like Heidegger and people like that, he's also in conversation with Ludwig Klages, I think, and with the early by the von Hooke school biology school systems thinking. So he's trying to distance himself from that idea that we live in the world in which something might have an environment, and he's trying to distinguish between these things. He does say in another text that we draw animals into the world of speech by the way that we relate to them, and that we can have an I and thou relationship with them, even though they don't use speech the way we do. So I think there are definitely possibilities to think something else than what he overtly says, which is that the animal is not the animal. It's basically Heidegger. The animal has no world, is weltlos, and it's sad. It's marked by sadness. I think that those ideas are there in the background. That yeah, we can think about that differently. Thanks
I
very much,
also
Daniel.
think that that in a significant way, Buber was an influence on the development of object relations theory in Britain. And it would be really interesting to explore that connection. So it challenges the Freudian idea that we become ourselves as autonomous beings through separation from any feelings of dependency. And that Buber's trying to, in some way, question that notion of autonomy as independence, which is there also in what Andreas and Peter were talking about in terms of the autonomous, self-sufficient individual of neoliberalism. And so even though he doesn't necessarily in this essay frame the politics directly, there is really an attempt to kind of rethink the way we are already in relationship with others, but also that in order to become autonomous and independent, we need to learn how to be dependent on others who we are also close to. And often that fear, which is often a very male fear of any form of dependency, being interpreted as a sign of weakness and a threat to masculine identities. So I think there's a way that Buber, even though we've said earlier, has that kind of masculine language, there's a way in thinking dependency as a form of relationship that we need to accept is opening up a very kind of new kind of territory, which is, as Johan was saying.
I think for next time we thought we could read the Carl Rogers Martin Buber dialogue, where this theme is also very important certainly in the background. Thanks for that, Vic. Anastasia.
Hi, everybody. My textual reading of Buber was more of a experiential affective immersion into the concepts and the kind of signification of the imagery that I drew. And emotionally, I found instances where I felt a sense of soothing in his words, and other times a sense of frustration and contradiction. So I step backward and try to detach myself from his phenomenological approach and try to use an ecofeminist understanding to what it means to be human and create a sense of humanity in relation to people as otherness, not othering, but also nature and spirituality. And that was a lot more productive for me, because I agree with Daniel and Andreas's comments in terms of the context with animals, and some of the arguments were somewhat conflicting and contradictory and frustrating for me. At the same time, I found a notion of homing, where proximity doesn't always create a sense of intimacy. And we've seen that in the current context, distance can become quite an intimate space of sharing and connection, even through the screen, to have that sensual understanding of the other with compassion and caring in a wider context of crisis. So understanding humanity and how to humanize the self with others by kind of stepping back and realizing that connection and caring doesn't necessarily mean coexistence, and it can't mean separation and detachment, was also, in terms of my own grappling with issues of trauma and healing, very useful. At the same time, I need to work on how, as Katrina says, my feminist ethical positionality is interfering with how I am accepting Buber. And maybe that's fine. Maybe that productive tension is a productive tension and not a limitation. So I would welcome discussions on the ethical and the feminist in relation to the textual and the Buberian in understanding humanity and human relations.
Thanks very much, Anastasia. These are absolutely crucial questions, and they determine, like you say, what we can take from Buber or learn from him, or what a dialogue with him it would involve, and it applies to both these things around exclusion of certain groups and in ways of speaking, and also this whole realm of nature, and what it means to maybe take something from him and think in a different way about these things. But very important. Thank you very much. Basilio. You have to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to participate in this conversation. I was not there last week. I'm here at the end of the Atlantic Ocean in New York and at St. John's University. I've been familiar with the Buber for the last 40 years. So I've been reading him and using him in my classes, my teachings. One thing that I did not do the reading assigned for this conversation, but from the conversation, I'm gathering that at least things that I'm rereading now, Buber again, particularly Arndau, in the context of technology and how technology is becoming kind of the mediation that's taking place, and thus I'm beginning to see more and more depersonalization of the human person. The human being is becoming more and more depersonalized, and you have this kind of a false sense of Zoom is providing us this this presence, false presence, you know. So, and you know, I'm reading again Arndau, keeping in mind two things: technology and trying to look at it a little more critically, and also trying to read Habermas, you know, the communicative architecture. How, particularly when I see, for example, we're trying to read Buber as if he was writing today. He was not writing today. He was writing in the 50s, in the 40s, and the 30s. So, what was the communicative architecture then, and what was the forms, the philological understanding of the words, of the language? So the whole semiotics, and somehow I get a little troubled when we are trying to read Buber as if he's writing in 2020, you know. And so, because we're not taking into account the communicative architecture of the times, and I think that is important for us to take into account. So those are my kind of little comments on that.
Yeah.
Right.
Thanks, Basilio. Yeah, we have to look into the context in which he writes and wrote, and I think the relation with Habermas is also one of my pet peeves. How much implicit Buber is in Habermas without ever getting the recognition for that. And I think there are some anecdotes also that sort of underline that. Would be interesting to go into that. There was something else. Yeah, presence. I got a key concept that you mentioned was presence, and of course that functions in the essay also in a very clear way. What does it mean to be present? So I think thanks for that, and we'll pick up on that as we go on. Jose.
Hi. No, it's me. Jose, it's me.
Yes.
Okay, so I've been traveling all last week, but I read before the Distance and Relation, and after the intervention of Vic, I have my mind start blowing, and I couldn't read more the text, and I stuck on the page 16, where he introduces the problem of biology, and immediately comes to my mind the chapter of Hannah Arendt's Life of Mind, where we are when we think. And immediately I start thinking about the concept, I was completely involved in the words of Vic, and I started starting to make a definition about distance or about relation, that we should start about the notion of I. And then I went back, I was revising Montaigne's appointments on the notion of I, Pascal appointments of the notion of I, because I know, you know that I'm not an specialist in Buber. So then I brought with me to my travels the I und Du, and I felt very angry because I could not understand anything that it's written in English. So only the notes makes me understand something that it's there. So and I stuck as well in the notion of those. My mind is blowing, and I don't have an idea. Just exposing it to share thoughts with you. It's a notion of language, which for me it went back to Hamann and to his text when he starts saying that speak for me to see you in Aesthetica Nuke, and all the tradition of this pre-romanticism, and then Fichte about how the capacity of language. So of course I try to avoid Heidegger. I try to make Heidegger a personal affair, no, not a public affair, but the things that when approaching to Buber, that blows my mind, in fact, is these notions that the missing in this text and in I und Du, as far as I can read it deeply, of a reflection, a deep reflection on language and how it arises, how it makes ourselves the space from where we speak and to whom we speak. And that's it. I'm completely. I have to. Vic, thank you very much, because perhaps you're going to drive me crazy, but I'm no, but because that's the problem. That's the definition of I and the meaning of I and the instruments that we can have to define that. No, so there are I blowers like Pascal, Clement Rosé, Hume, Montaigne, and there is another that are not eye blowers who start to stuck on the eye, on the very notion of eye, and I could not situate Buber up till now. So I hope you can help me in understanding this point of view, since I never study as systematically Martin Buber.
Thank you. Thank you, Jose. There's no this relation to German Romanticist philosophy of language, Hamann, Herder, but also indeed Jacobi and Fichte, also von Humboldt. So there's a key passage in von Humboldt that relate where von Humboldt says, "Das Ich braucht ein Du," the I needs a thou. So that's an idea that comes up there. But again, my thesis or hypothesis would be that again he uses it in ways that are useful to him, but he's at the same time also breaking out of this framework of German idealism. So we can look at that in detail. I just wanted to add one more thing. This question, what does it mean to exist in speech, as you could say it? That is for me also the crucial question, and so that's how I approach Buber and what he means to me. It is very interesting to know, historically speaking, that when he wrote I and Thou, I don't know if people know it, maybe you do, he had just put himself on 2 years of what he called an intellectual fast. He didn't read anything in the 2 or 3 years prior to writing I and Thou. Then the only book he read was Descartes' Discourse on Method. And I think once you see that that's in his mind, it's almost as if he is he wants to provide modern philosophy with another foundation, but he wants to go back to this monological beginning in Descartes and say there's actually something underneath that. Descartes is itself already dialogical. And if you read the Meditations, you know that that is a dialogical text through and through, although it's never put in those words. So I find that very interesting. So this question of the I, that I think is very much also in the mind of Buber as he's working out these ideas. Thanks.
It's also interesting that even though he wants to talk about the relationship between I and thou, there is a way that often it can be difficult to feel Buber's I, that he doesn't talk very easily about the first person, or he talks about the first person, but he finds it very hard to speak and write out of his first person experience, which I think can make reading I and Thou very frustrating, because he wants you to ground it in a sense of the I in relationship with others, but he doesn't really share in a way that feminist work of the second wave did, the importance or recognition of the I in relationship to. So at some level, he doesn't have a very strong personal voice.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things which is so striking and in some way disturbing.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, Carrie.
Hi. Apologies if it looks like I'm not looking at the screen. I've actually got two screens. And when I look at this one, you're all really small. So I look at that one to actually look at you. So that says something weird about the nature of this this encounter. Hello, I'm sorry I wasn't there last week. I'm in Sweden at the moment. So anybody wants to ask any questions about how you deal with coronavirus in the strange country, happy to answer. Briefly, I mean, a couple of things that occurred to me. I think echoing some of the comments about the feminist reading, I'm not sure I take as a starting point the typical nature of two men informing one another of their basically different views about an object, each aiming to convince the other of the rightness of their way of viewing the matter. That to me does not necessarily constitute the point against which we might be defining ourselves. And I was just thinking that, you know, he's writing post Virginia Woolf, for example. My background's literature, not philosophy. And Virginia Woolf fundamentally disrupts the idea that you are in that sort of relation. And she kind of destroys the I at the center of things. So I don't think it's just a question of the moment of time or the gender. I think there is an intentional intervention into a particular conversation here, which I think is a particular sort of philosophical conversation. And then the second thing that really struck me was the section on page 69, where for the first time we get a notion of vulnerability, I think. The idea that man is finite, is partial, in need of completion. So I wonder how that concept of vulnerability relates, which I read as a generative vulnerability, relates to this man that is able to separate himself from the world and view it from a distance. You know, it feels like there's an interesting tension there. And I suppose that also relates to questions for me about persistence and change, and how I was interested in his framing of tools as persistent, as things that keep their, if you like, essence on a continuous basis. And that I read that very differently through a sort of sociocultural psychological approach, which is actually that the tool is also always in relation. The tool is not the external. So I think this question about persistence, change, partialness, vulnerability, how these relate to each other, to me seems just really interesting. So thank you for sharing.
Okay, great, thank you. Yeah, so vulnerability, I think that's really important, and to see how he thinks that in relation to distancing. That's, I think, a very crucial concept. Is this an I that is the substantive I of the modern tradition, or is there something else going on there? And with these tools, yeah, okay, we'll talk about that. I think he gets it straight out of Heidegger. And for Heidegger, the tool is always part of a whole world context, without which it cannot be understood. So he says the hammer relates to history, the hammer relates to the past, the future, otherwise it's nothing. So, but yeah, there's definitely that. Yeah, thanks very much, Carrie.
It's interesting how vulnerability comes right at the end. A lot of people are focused on that last section, and it's almost like you have to do a lot of work, or he makes you feel that you need to do a lot of work before you can even get to vulnerability. So it's interesting what it would have been like if he'd written this article, Distance and Relationship, but reversed it, started where he ended, and then from the point of vulnerability, thinking about relationships to nature.
Yeah.
That's just a thought.
Well, it's not for nothing called Distance and Relation, and not Relation and Distance.
Yeah.
And I think that that also points out some of the, I don't want to say limitations, but
yeah,
there's the golden nugget here, I think, but there's also a lot of mud. Yeah. Well, we'll see. Sylvia. Can you unmute yourself?
Is that so?
Sylvia? Or is she writing something? Hang on.
Okay.
Ah, yeah.
Hello. I think in Buber's approach, the distance is closeness. The distance between people is an opportunity to relate and give empathy. And this is my main interest, because I think if we don't try to be in I and thou relation to each other, then we lose the possibility to relate to God and to understand our wholeness. And through the relation I and thou between people, we can reach the transcendental or absolute ethic, which Buber assumes. And the main doubt of Buber that interests me, that the distance is closeness indeed. I mean, if I can, the I can find its own integrity before entering the relation, it can form I and thou relation to others. So my main interest is the absolute ethic which Buber claims in Eclipse of God. Okay. Briefly, this is my reflection about this text, but I would like to write a longer reflection later.
Fine.
Thank you very much. And but I think you made a very important remark. Distance is closeness, and that begins to, I think, begins to show how Buber wants to use this term in the text. It is not the distance of, oh, you're at a distance. That is a distance that makes an I-thou relation possible.
Yes.
So it's quite the opposite from distancing, and it is the precondition. He sees it as the presupposition for vulnerability in a way.
Yes, and that was a sentence that on page 64, men can feel the act of setting at a distance with the will to relation.
Yes, precisely. And there are two relations possible in a way. So the I-it and the I-thou both happen on the basis of distancing. Mm-hmm. He seems to be using this Heideggerian notion of a world to indicate what distancing is.
Yes.
But it doesn't have. I think it doesn't need Heidegger for that. But it is a very important point, and it's so it the question what distancing precisely is of course is the central one. So thanks for highlighting that side of it. I think we were sort of risking a little bit moving into the direction of thinking distancing is bad, relation is good, and how does that work? And yeah, okay, thanks, great. Anna.
Hi. What really interests me in this text is the concept of relation. I said last time that I'm totally new to Buber and I come from a background of process philosophy. So for me, entering into relation means entering into the events emergence of relationality. And as I started to read Buber, I realized that he really does not have the same definition as I do of relation. So out of this curiosity to understand who's this guy and what he's talking about, so my question is mainly, what does he mean by relation? And in this twofold principle of distancing and relation, what I got is that when he mentions distancing, for me, in my own language, is the principle that you appropriate yourself as an individual being, as someone. And even though in the relational field you are part of everything in the act of a conscious communication when you are using language and so forth. This act is an act that comes from the reflective mind, an act that we cannot just put aside because you're only looking for relationality. So my challenge in this class on Buber is to understand how can I appropriate these concepts to my own scheme of concepts, and how can I understand Buber's relationality. And in doing, like, in the questions that you sent, Johan, the one that really interests me is the fifth one. What is the relation in this text between Buber's philosophy and a phenomenological account of intersubjectivity? Because from my understanding, when he's talking about entering into relation, that's how I understand it. It's entering into intersubjectivity. So I don't know if this is accurate.
Okay, well, those are great questions, and we'll get to them afterwards. And I think this relation to phenomenology is very important. The relation to process philosophy also, I have an idea about that, but I don't want to start to talking about it now. But we can get to that later on. But thanks for these questions. I'm going to keep them in mind. Nathaniel.
Hi, everyone. Greetings from Birmingham, in the UK. Just 3 quick points. I've not actually read the text, but just listening to the comments. I've just come back from teaching Max Weber. And obviously Max Weber kind of gives this idea of modernity as monological, in the sense that it just crashes in on itself and it doesn't kind of relate to anything other. That might be what it could be, what it ought to be. And so I think if the social conditions of possibility for Buber talking about the I am now is modernity, then we probably share a more intensified version of that. So in a way, talking about Buber now kind of makes even more sense, if you like, because the question is becoming more urgent about how we kind of broaden the horizons of how we relate, not only between ourselves, but as a we to something that we are not yet, bringing in a bit of Ernst Bloch, who I studied. Then just another 2 quick points. The first one is something I'm interested in is how does the prospect of ecological crisis that obviously we're experiencing as a possibility, how does that possibility of non-relation come to affect our communication now between the I and now? And then also just the question of full automation. So looking at like Marx's idea of the real subsumption of labor, so the technological object kind of increasingly withdrawing the human hand from, how we go about kind of interacting with nature, if you like. How does that kind of possibility of the real subsumption of speech affect speech now as well? So these are just some of the questions that I'm interested in. But like I said, I've not read the text, so I don't want to kind of take too much of your time up with my comments.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Nathaniel, and welcome. And I think how is the possibility of non-relation to be thought? I think that's a crucial question that also speaks for Buber, I think, to the theological background, to the absence of God. But we can talk about that later on as well. And the withdrawal of the human hand, or maybe even the withdrawal of speech, and how for Buber speech is something cannot be technologified in an essential way, or so. That these things, of course, very important. So thanks for these contributions. Then, Shazay, you have to unmute yourself. And thanks everyone for these contributions. I think it's really stimulating to hear everybody's point of view.
So because our societies are so divided along so many fault lines, I found it delightful to read from Buber.
You have to speak a bit louder.
Yeah, because our societies are so divided along so many fault lines, I found it delightful to read from Buber in Distance and Relation that there is such a thing as, in his own words, a genuine conversion, that partners in dialogue who have different perspectives about anything can still arrive at a point of consensus so that affirmation of one's interlocutor is not synonymous at the moment of controversy with simply agreeing to disagree, which is the point where many of us are content to terminate dialogue. For me, as a writer of editorials, this invites me to look for ways of presenting truth or of seeing what thou presents as truth so that those truths cease to be stumbling blocks to relation. And I think this is an invitation to expand spaces for relation for all of us. It reminds me of that part of I Am Thou where Buber talked about a culture where the word for far was only one word that means something like, if I remember correctly, somewhere I cannot see mother. They don't say I'm far. They say I'm somewhere I cannot see mother. So isolation for Buber is overcome when we create conditions where everywhere becomes, so to speak, a place where we can see mother, where we are always ready to step out of the I thou. And this brings me to you said, Johan, earlier about reading Buber's thoughts on nature and animals in the context of his writings. I Am Thou, where, again, if I remember rightly, he hints at how we might enter into an I-thou relation with a cat and with a tree, while acknowledging that we do not share their language.
Okay, thanks very much. I think that maybe some of you may not have heard everything. You fell away several times, but this relation to nature is of course important, and what this notion of convincing or of the relation to the other can mean for the public sphere, as you mentioned, that is I think something that was mentioned before and that we're definitely going to get back to. Thanks very much for that, Philip.
That's me, I guess.
That's you.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, and thank you also for having me. I also wasn't with you the first session. I was unfortunately busy, but I'm happy to be here now. Now, I did not read the text because I thought that you read it the last time or discussed it the last time. Usually these things play out like this, that it takes longer to get through these texts. Or so anyway, I wasn't smart enough to read it. Didn't think about this, so I can't really say anything about the text. I just thought that from the little bits and pieces I've gathered from what you were talking about. So I've only read I and Thou by Martin Buber and parts of the Paths of Utopia, and just very generally, distance and relation reminded me, and I think this latches on to what Sylvia said, that there's a passage in I and Thou, now I don't know exactly, it might be in the second or in the third part, where he kind of has a critical discussion of the tradition of mysticism, where there's this kind of endeavor to lose oneself in God or whatever. So this kind of goal of yes, self-eradication, or there's any kind of distance being obliterated, as it were, and he's critical of that, yeah, and I just thought that this is very telling and interesting. So maybe at some point we can discuss this a bit more. That for him, obviously, that there needs to be a distance between I and Thou in order for there to be a relation in the first place.
Yes,
that's great.
So
where are you speaking? Why don't you just introduce yourself, just to say a few words?
Sorry. As you know, my name is Philip, and I'm doing my PhD in philosophy at the moment. I write on love, philosophy of love as it were a force of moral and social transformation. And I had a reading group on Martin Buber on I and Thou, and it was very eye-opening for me. It shaped my whole outlook on my whole dissertation project very much. So that's why I thought I would like to join this.
And where are you?
I'm at the moment, probably you don't know it, in Pardubice, in the Czech Republic, the Center for Ethics of Human Value.
Yeah. We know
Yeah,
it. Yeah. Welcome to the seminar. And I think this, I mean, I kept saying this, but I think this sort of puts the nail on the head in terms of what Buber's trying to say is that you need distance in order to have relation, and you need relation in order to have distance. And that is what we mean by communication. That is why speech is that's why the little story that I put at the end of the explanation online, this little story about the rabbi who says, why they ask why did we not say God created the world by thought, but by the word? And then he explains that this, or I'll put it up in a minute. He explains that why that is. So I think that is the whole point, and it goes right back to his relation to Neoplatonic mysticism and the whole mystical tradition in the West, which he comes to his own experience around the time of the First World War, and with Gustav Landauer, we'll talk about that as well. That he realized that this kind of elevation into unity with the divine, that takes us away from the ground where meeting and communication and togetherness happens, and that is the world in which we do not merge with anything, but we become and remain ourselves as we are in relation with others. That seems to me to be the crucial point. Yeah. Thanks very much for these contributions. Mary.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, I'm really glad I could make it to this seminar. I wasn't able to make it to the first one, so apologies. My reading of the text has been very superficial, I'm afraid to say, but what struck me was the part where Buber talks about the twofold basis of human life and the way in which one individual confirms another. And I've been reading Marx and writing a little bit about Karl Marx and the way in which in the contemporary moment we've fetishized this technical apparatus. And it just led me to think about how how this relates to what Marx says about the way in which individuals tend towards a personification of economic categories, and the way that confirmation perhaps becomes distorted a little bit because of the economic context, and certainly now the neoliberal context in which we all exist. So I think that what I'd like to do is read the text again with that to probe in more depth.
Okay, thanks very much. And I think the relation to Marxism is something that we want to explore, especially in semester 2, where we want to look at some alternative accounts of social relations, and this will come in as a very important topic. I think Buber was much aware of the fact that Feuerbach introduces, it also takes over from these early German Romanticist sources, the idea of a fundamental I-thou relation. And if we think about how Marx talks about the abstract nature of Feuerbach's view of human relation, you want to make them more concrete, we get into something that must approach Buber in some sense or other. So that'll be a very important thing to think about. Thank you for that contribution. Federico.
Yeah, hi. Good afternoon to everyone. So just a few remarks about the text, because I think that the point that I will bring up have been already been touched upon by several of you. But first of all, I also was struck by the Heideggerian influence, by the language, by that Buber uses, especially at the very beginning when he poses the questions. The question is about the ground, the Grund, and then he uses these concepts of Wesen, Sein, and so on. And I also thought about the writing style, which is very smooth and leads the reader from the beginning to the end. Also, that reminded me a bit of how Heidegger used to write. So I wonder whether, basically, to what extent the Heideggerian ontology had an impact on Buber, and whether raising a question about the ground of human being can be sufficient or can be useful, and also can we can we overcome Heideggerian ontology by posing questions in this way? And that is the first remark. And the second was about the last bit, the last two paragraphs of the text. One is I was really fascinated by the concept of genuine meeting, where Buber talks about the desire to influence another without this necessarily meaning provoking a change or forcing a change in the other. And he uses this metaphor of a seed, of something that one, in a way, puts into the other and let it grow, but let it grow in the freedom, so without actually having a direct influence on this seed. So we don't have control of this seed when we enter into relation into the other, and this is the only way of having a genuine conversation. So of accepting the otherness. So there is I think also the notion of freedom and comes up with this. And I was also struck by this passage at the bottom of page 69, which has already been pointed out, the one where encountering the other means acknowledging finitude, partialness, but at the same time, that the other bit of the sentence says that in my relation to the other, we are both in relation to truth. And I wonder whether it is this relation with truth that can be the actual ground we are looking for, or to what extent this can be, and what is the role of this mutual relation with truth in building, wrapping up, and building this relation. And another point was in the one in the last paragraph, when Buber talks about almost the paradox in the relation when the event of making present happens. And I wonder whether he here refers to a form of empathy. I think that it was maybe Sylvia who used this term. And I think that could be a way of understanding what Buber says, because he clearly says that he talks about the experiencing the pain of the other. And he talks about it, but so this experience comes through imagining the reality of this pain. So what role has imagination does imagination play in this in this relation? Last point, it's the brief remark that Buber has when he talks about speech, and he says that probably the first kind of word we had is the individual's name, and that points me towards what we were discussing, what some of you were discussing about the I, the subject. So I, as the subject, maybe I should think about the I first of all as an individual name, first of all as a name, but the name is intrinsically part of speech, and so intrinsically is linked to relation. So the very essence. So in this sense, maybe Buber could be seen as a challenge to the primacy of the Cartesian subject, because the name, what defines my identity, then is related to speech, and speech is related to relation. But that is something that it's just a conjecture at this point, and I'd like to hear your remarks or to discuss this point later. Yeah.
Okay, great. Then we'll do that later, but that's a very, very interesting remark, this place of the name. In fact, Victor, do you want to say something? Or not?
Just just about time. I mean, this has been a wonderful discussion.
Yeah.
But we thought this class would get smaller, but it's getting larger, which is a lovely, lovely sign of relation and communication. But I just wondered, I need a 5-minute break. I don't know whether people, it's just been so rich going round. There's so many issues that have raised. So I think we need some moment of reflection, possibly just towards the end.
Yeah.
We'll think about how best to proceed. You know?
Can we listen to Jordan, who is our last respondent, and then we take a break, and then we see what we can do in the time that we have left. It's I'm very much aware. I said let's take half an hour for this. It takes much longer, but as we said, we're experimenting with how to be together in this space, where the between lies, and yeah, well, we'll feel our way, but we'll take a break. Jordan, you're up last, and then we take a break.
Thank you. It's been so interesting to hear everyone, and I appreciate the last comment about a break too. It gives me a little bit of I don't know, helps me frame things. But let's see. I have 3 points that I was thinking of sharing, and I believe some of them were touched upon in one way or another. But I think the first point may not have been. And I noticed when I started reading this chapter, to me, distance and relation can be understood in terms of juxtaposition, or as Buber says, contrast. And I found that to be a striking parallel to a reading of the Bereshit, the first parasha of the Torah. And I noticed there that the idea of separation or juxtaposition, in which the divine enacted influence to create, was really quite fascinating. And I thought of the sort of the creative vitality in, you could say, separating, or you could say contrasting, as Buber does, or juxtaposing. And I noticed, as what we said recently, we need distance to have relation. We need relation to have distance. So there's a sort of a symbiotic coexistence that takes place, which I found really interesting. That was my first observation. And there were a couple of things I'll say informally that floored me. The first big point was the human yearning to be confirmed by another. And that to me was something that struck deeply. And I'm very curious in looking at that question as it relates to the public sphere, and particularly with regards to rebellion, revolution, or violence. And considering my own professional background and formation, to me, Buber's writing on the need to be confirmed is something that is a phenomenon, I would even think, that may be noticed perhaps in formal peace processes or peace accords, where you have divergent groups vying for recognition. By whom or from whom? That's an interesting question. But that's something that I certainly see, from Colombia to, for example, Israel-Palestine. And I believe my last point, Federico made mention of this, the idea of truth. And to me, this was the second and just thrilling notion I noticed in the essay, that to me, Buber is suggesting there is something called truth, one truth perhaps, but at the same time, as human beings, we are only capable of possessing a fragment or a part of that truth, which to me was a very Kabbalistic notion, which I guess isn't surprising considering Buber's foundation in Hasidic thought. So those were my my observations that
Okay, great.
or inspired by the reading. So thank
Yeah.
you for the opportunity.
Yeah. Cool. I think this notion of recognition is very important. And we have in social philosophy at the moment a reigning discourse around recognition, which is based on the late Frankfurt School work by Honneth, the grammar of social conflict, which is basically Hegelian notion of the dialectical notion of the struggle for recognition. I think Buber goes far beyond that in very interesting ways. We'll talk more about that as well. Now we're going to take a break. And I will see, shall we say until 1:45, or is that not long enough to 10 to? Vic, you be the arbiter. Oh, he's already gone.
Are we finishing at 6?
Yeah, we're finishing at 6. I know, but he wants a break.
So we're going to have a 20-minute break, and then
just take a 10-minute break.
Take a 10-minute break, and then we see how we wrap up.
Let's start again at 1:45, or just 5. Should we just take a 5-minute break then?
Yeah, good idea.
So we start again at 22.
Yeah. What's 2? Okay. Right.
Do you want to give the background now, Johan?
Sorry?
Do you want to give the background to the
Yeah,
piece?
yeah. Shall I sort of maybe say a bit about that, and then it'll be time, right? I mean, I just wanted to. So I've been typing along as everybody's been speaking, and I think we have a number of very important themes here that we can possibly maybe also maybe take into the next session. This is something that we may have to think about. Is this enough for this chapter, or are we going to get back to this before we move on to the next? I feel that I would say there's probably a need to maybe talk a little bit more in depth about some of the things that we have been raising, right? So I'll share this this thing now. Yeah, so here we have the text. So basically what I wanted to highlight is, well, first of all, just as a contextualization of this article, is that for the point I already made, it's called Urdistanz und Beziehung in German, so primordial distance, and we see that word coming back in the phrase the primal setting at the distance. Which he quotes, there's a phrase he uses right at the beginning. So there's something here that has to do with primordiality. It's not the distancing that we would find in the empirical world when I am distant from you, or we are not in the same room, or I feel distant from you. This whole sphere of even of feelings and emotions and physical orientation, that's still all within, for Buber, is still all within the realm of, sorry, I'm trying to keep track of everything, there's a problem with the chat. People are not able to chat to the whole group. I don't know why that is. I'll try to sort it out. So, but thanks, Carrie, for pointing that out. There must be another weird setting of the University of London. So I just wanted to say that we're talking here about a notion of distancing that is quite fundamental, and that maybe we should try to start by not thinking too much about distance as an empirical category that we know. So this is a late text that was written as an article and published as an article in 1950, and obviously, as was already pointed out, it relates in a certain way to I and Thou, because it is very much talking about the same sort of things. However, at the beginning, Buber says that the question that he wishes to discuss is that of the principle of human life, its beginning. He uses there the word principle or beginning with the arche, which is the beginning. There's a whole discourse that is in the background there. We are reminded of Heidegger's musings on the word principle, which is something that was written at roughly around the same time, where Heidegger reflects on the word axiom, that which is valuable or which should always remain in the midst of our thought, that to which we should always return. It is not a starting point, as Buber also points out, but it is that around which human life in a way circles. And I just wanted to point out that if we begin to relate this to I and Thou, then we might say that distance and relation we understand wrong. If we could, everybody mute themselves, otherwise we can't hear. Vic, you too. We don't understand it in the right way if we think that distance is I it, and relation is I-Dao. Friedman, in the introduction to this book, misunderstands it in that way, and then he doesn't get out of the model that he gets himself in. We're not going to go over that, but we might think of the I-it relation and the I-Dao relation as an original insight that Buber is trying to formulate. There is something about the I-Dao relation which removes it from all sorts of other connections that we might normally have, and we try to understand what it is. Buber seems to be using a Kantian language in I and Dao, as I said, and he seems to be using a Heideggerian language in this essay. If you remind yourself of Kant, those who have read him and those who haven't read him, you can easily understand it. Kant has this idea that there are two realms of which we are citizens. He says we are citizens of two realms. There is the realm of necessity, and that is the realm of nature, and he thinks that is also the realm of the body. That is where causal efficacy and laws of nature obtain. And then there is the kingdom of freedom, and that is the moral realm, or the noumenal realm, he calls it also. And that is where values obtain, or duties even. And these two are radically different, and they have different modes of knowing. The noumenal realm is, we know about it in terms of the postulates of practical action, the fact that we can be responsible, which is a fact, the fact that we have an ethical intuition, that means that there must be a place in the world in which we are free, whereas natural science tells us that nature is not that place, and we participate in nature as well. It's easy to see that when you look into the text of I and Dao, that Buber models the relation between the I-it and the I-Dao on this distinction between the kingdom of necessity and the kingdom of ends, or the kingdom of freedom. Because the kingdom of the I-it relation is a relation in which lawfulness obtains, it's a relation of causal efficacy, it's a relation of categorization, it's a relation of in which one thing borders on another. So it's the relation of nature in which there is contiguity, there are no gaps, everything fits, and when you're part of it, you are in a fateful world. He uses also the image of fate there. And then there is this other possibility for us, and that is associated with speech, and that is to be in a free relation with others, or also with, not just with human beings. He has a long discussion on an I-Dao relation, or an encounter with a tree. And this is where we encounter things and people and the world in terms of what every individual thing or person or being is in themselves. So that is, and you can easily see how he models that on this relationship. If we go to this text, I'm going a bit quick now, but just to indicate in very broad brushstrokes where the differences are. He makes it clear that this distancing, we're still trying to understand what it is, underlies both an I-it orientation towards the world and an I-Dao orientation towards the world. It is the precondition of both objectifying the other, but also of entering into a personal relation with the other. So what he's trying to do here, and that's why he says, I'm going back to the beginning, or the principle of human life, is to articulate this duality in which we live, having the possibility to enter into an I-Dao relation, but also being in an I-it relation towards things. The ground of possibility of that's where this language of grounds comes in, is this Urdistance, is this primordial distance that makes that we have a world. And then in that world, there can be no other thing to do in a world than to relate. But the relation that he is here talking about can be an objective one, or it can be, I'm not going to say a subjective one, but it can be an intersubjective one. And that has, so we cannot say that the I-it relation is the relation of distancing. That's one way in which these two texts are related. So we are, in a way, that's also why a lot of scholars have said that this is a kind of next step for Buber. He is trying to get into the conditions of possibility, if you can put it like that, of this distinction between I-it and I-thou. And that's, of course, a question that has huge implications, because one of the things that, for example, Franz Rosenzweig pointed out after reading I and Thou was that it was too a cliche, it was too much I-it bad, I-thou good, without thinking through the ground of where these things come from. And I think that is how we have to see this text, that he's trying to do that here. But he is using the same approach that he uses in I and Thou, which is, as I said, it is a kind of stylistic device to use philosophical ideas to make a point that maybe in a way goes beyond that. And you see that here, Federico also pointed this out in the way that he uses Heidegger's analysis, that's here on page 61. He uses Heidegger's analysis of the world, of how Dasein is how we as subjects are in the world, to explain this relation of distance. And what he's trying to say is, this is a very, very well-known discussion in his time, an environment is not a world, because an environment is simply a situation in which you are like an orange in its skin. Everything that comes to you from the environment is directly taken up in a kind of systematic relationship that you have with it. When you have a world, this is a phenomenological conception of a world that begins to be developed by Husserl, and then is extended by Heidegger, and later on also by others. When you have a world, then one of the key things about a world is that you are aware that it is a totality, but you cannot grasp the totality, you know of it, but you don't know it. Everything is in the world. That's an interesting thing that he also relates back to Heraclitus, who gives this idea to Western philosophy. So one of Heraclitus' sayings is there's only one world for the waking. He talks about that in the essay on Heraclitus. So a world is a unity. It is again, he uses a Kantian phrase here. It is the counterpart of the synthetic unity of the subject. We have a sense of being one. And that world so it's a totality, and in that world, I am one of the occupants. There are also others, and I don't know these. I know them, but I don't know them completely. So he uses this idea, this phrase over againstness, to say something is only available for me as a part of the world if I can encounter it, if it's over against me, if I can see it or walk to it or have a relationship with it, but it is not, there's a gap between me and that thing. That gap, for example, appears as the fact that I cannot totally embrace or know something from all possible angles. It applies to our sense of space, for example. If you, in a phenomenological description of the world, you have an object, you know that it has a backside. You can turn it around so you can look at the backside, but you can't look at it from all sides at the same time. If you could do that, it wouldn't be an object in a world. Merleau-Ponty gives this very nice thought example. He says, you imagine you're sitting in your room now. Imagine that you're sitting a little bit to the left. Your room looks a little bit different. Now imagine that you see the place where you are from all possible perspectives at the same time. Then, you know, if you try to, you can't do that, but if you try to imagine that, you notice that the sense of being in a space disappears. And so this notion of adumbration, something is there and something is not there, there is a background and a foreground, that's essential for world. Now, what he is doing here, and he does this here in this little line, these lines here at the end. This is the notion of distance that he works with. This is what he uses to get to the idea that there is a fundamental opening up. Maybe he could have used the word opening up. That puts us in the world. He tries to say this is typically human. We can discuss that, whether animals have a world or plants have a world. Why not? I don't feel that it's particularly necessary to say that only we have that, and even not if you link it so closely as he does later on to speech. But we can talk about that at some other time. But he uses this idea of this over against, as we can now begin to understand a little bit what he means by that. The possibility of encountering something means that it's in a world that I know it's there, but it's not. I don't know everything about it. I'm in and then I can be in a relation to it. But this can be an I-it relation. This can be a relation of knowing, analyzing, trying to get under control, or reducing it to instances of a category, or it can be a relation of presence. It can be a relation in which I become aware of the fact that I'm present with someone or something else than me, and at the same time I'm sharing my world with them or with it, and that is an act. That puts us in the I-thou relation. It is then a form of, he calls it, so he says the setting at a distance is a universal. Yeah, I will look this up for you. The setting at a distance is universal. The moving into a relation is personal. Sorry, I can't go so fast now with all this different stuff. Yeah, sorry, it's going too fast and I can't find it in text. But he says the setting at a distance is a kind of universalization. We enter a world, we realize for the first time we have a world at all, in which there are things to be seen and to experience and things to encounter. And then we go into a personal relation, and that is a kind of particularization. It's always an orientation on you as this particular person, or this tree as this particular tree, not an oak tree in the park, but this particular one. And that is an act of presencing. And so it seems that this anthropological possibility of presencing allows the world to appear as a world and allows me to be in a relation to everything in the world that is particular, that addresses the particular existence or being of all those things, rather than what they represent or their identity or something, but just the being of this particular thing. That is what is the ground of this presence or empathy. And it is, if I understand the text correctly, entering into this relation is an act of the will. It is something that maybe doesn't always work, but it is something we can relate, because it's already there in a way. The Urdistance is just the universal general face of this movement. They really belong together, these two movements. It's already there, because once the world is opened up, potentially there is my relating to the being of the beings in it. And so it becomes an act, and that's maybe where it differs in a fundamental way from Heidegger, for whom this experience of the openness of the world is given to us. It's a kind of act of grace. I'll have to give another talk about grace in this text, but it's very different from Heidegger in that perspective. It is an act of the will. We can will to do this. We can will to be empathic, and we can will to be with someone or to be present, but we can also choose not to do that. Yeah, it's 3 minutes past 6, so I feel that I'm going to have to stop now.
Just say, I think it's really helpful. I just want to say two things. One, just question the notion of where the will comes from and whether it is an act of will, but also just to raise the question that many people do about grounding, and what it means to ground oneself in a relationship, particularly at a moment of COVID, when I'm thinking about living through a moment of kind of grief, and then how reading Buber and also thinking about this phrase, a phrase that Wittgenstein says, which is, the world of the unhappy person is very different from the world of the happy. person. So he uses the notion of world in a way that we can identify and recognize. And it might be that there's a way that the world of someone like myself in grief at the moment is different from the world that I inhabit if I'm not in a position of grief or mourning. And how this connects is that in a kind of neoliberal culture, the idea of grief or mourning is seen as almost a kind of waste of time. It's like something within a utilitarian culture that you're made to feel, no, your task is to bring people back into the world. If you know someone who's in grief, the idea is you want to minimize that pain or that process, and you want to help them back into the world. And Buber seems a way here of understanding, no, it's not that there's one world that you need to bring people back in, but there's a need of recognizing how we're living in different worlds, that we're grounded in different worlds in ways that can be very difficult for us to identify. But unless we're grounded in that world, the world that we're in, even if we're in denial about it, it becomes very difficult to communicate across or with others or enter into a notion of dialogue with them. And I thought it was very interesting to think whether in this piece of Distance and Relation, he's starting again, because he doesn't mention I and thou. And it's and you wonder why, because that's so well known. It's as if he's trying to start in a kind of different way. And in some ways it's got strengths in it, but at another level, it also remains quite impersonalized in a strange sense of the world that you're in until the last section, which everybody and none people in their comments have focused on the last section, where something comes alive. You feel Buber's presence and you feel his engagement with the question of how we need others in order to be able to enter into relationships with them.
Yes, I think that is true, and I think so. I think he uses this abstract philosophical language to make a point, and maybe that, like you already suggested, maybe could have started the other way around. But nevertheless, he is trying to. So, and maybe it's also just the rhetoric of the text. He's trying to put on the voice of somebody who's going to give a foundation once and for all for his view of things. So maybe that plays a role as well. But the text definitely invites us to connect to what is alive, and without that we cannot make sense of what this personalization of the relation to the world and the beings in it might turn out to be. Yeah, no, absolutely. Maybe this is a general problem with Buber, that you try to apply philosophy to get to a sense of awareness of the between that has to leave behind some of the categories, some of the what you refer to Wittgenstein. You have to sort of use the ladder and then throw it away when you're done with it. That could well be the case, but we'll see that it is worthwhile to go through the steps that he takes to get to that point. Right. I think we have to stop now. It is 10 minutes past 6. Maybe it is. What do you think? Shall we spend maybe the next session? The first will be very disciplined in our usage of time. We spent the first hour to finish the discussion on distance and relation, and then we make a start with the Buber-Rogers dialogue which will be the same topics, but a different text in the second hour, and then maybe takes us into the third seminar as well. That text, the Buber-Rogers Dialog, is also already in your folder, so you can read it there. That text has a long history. We've got the original one, as it were, from the Knowledge of Man, this wonderful book that is so incredibly hard to get these days. There is a whole reissue and a much better version that was published several years ago by some communication scholars. That has definitely got advantages if you're interested in the precise historical background, but as the Buber dialogue that we have now here, it has become influential. And so that is the text that we will take as our starting point. So I will also put on in the folder a document with the points that were raised now and the comments some people made. I typed it up as best as I could. If you feel that you want to add something there, please go ahead and do that. The recording, I'll send it out as soon as it is available. And then I'm looking forward very much to seeing you all in 2 weeks. And Vic, thank you very much for your contributions. Everyone, thank you for your contributions.
Thank you, Johan.
Okay, and then I think we can stop now. So thanks very much.